You're listening to The Artist Athlete, episode 42. This podcast is dedicated to Circus. It's a place for professionals in the industry to share their stories, viewpoints, and information, and a place for outsiders to get a sneak peek into this world. Hey friends, fans, and enemies, I'm Shannon McKenna, and I'm the host of the Artist Athlete podcast and the founder of theartistathlete.com. Shout out, as always, to my badass rock stars, my heart of hearts, my loves to the moon and back, my Patreons. Patreons give small amounts of money each month to support art, like this podcast, so it can get made. As you'll hear in this episode today, funding art is one of the most important ways of expressing its value in an economically capitalist society, and Patreons, you are doing your part. To help fund the podcast, you can go to patreon.com/theartistathlete and start giving today. Again, it's patreon.com/theartistathlete. My guest today is Hadassah Damien. And Hadassah is actually not a circus artist, though her partner used to be. But Hadassah is the founder of Ride Free Fearless Money, an online resource for artists who want to take control of their finances. They have launched both freelance and collective businesses, defaulted on the now paid off student loans, and saved $15,000 while making $30,000 a year as a part-time employed working artist touring in the U.S. with queer femme art. Wow. If you're about to turn off this episode and wait until next week when I interview a super awesome Cirque du Soleil star or a famous Instagram aerial instructor, I want you to take a moment and just listen to this interview. I wanted to bring Hadassah on the show as part of my ongoing study of how circus artists relate to money. As we talk about in the interview, you'll hear this. There's something within our economic system that benefits from individuals, people like us, staying ignorant or stressed out or avoiding learning about money. But I think we could change that. What if instead of this old trope of artists being bad with money, we as artists were extraordinarily good with our money, as creative and smart about it as we are utilizing other resources in our community? Even if you're not an artist, but someone who enjoys watching circus, your role is as important in this discussion. Hadassah would say, you have one of the most important roles in this discussion. So give it a moment. Listen up. I was so excited to have Hadassah on, and we clicked so immediately that I kind of forgot I was giving an interview. So in the beginning of this recording, Hadassah is actually interviewing me. But don't worry, we launch into the meat of it soon enough. Here's my interview with Hadassah Damien. Sweet. Well, thank you so much for Skyping me up.
Yeah. How long have you been doing these interviews for? Or a podcast, I suppose I should ask.
Yeah, I've been doing the podcast since, March 1st, I think was my first one. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. And is it something that you were doing, because it's like the opposite of doing a circus art, right? It's like sitting down and, in my assumption, it's the opposite of doing circus arts, to sit down and work with technology and be making a podcast. But I'm curious for you, like, if you chose it to like balance out that other work or to bring another facet of information to the media you're making or something like that.
Mostly that one. Yeah, I felt like and I still think that there's a real disconnect between this whole community and everyone else in the world. It's this kind of like weird art form that people know as like Cirque du Soleil. That's the main question I get when I tell people that I'm a circus artist. They're like, oh, do you work for Cirque du Soleil? And I'm like,
interesting.
Yeah. So I wanted to kind of present through interviews with circus artists
information about the community and kind of make it more relatable so people could understand that we are working and we're artists and we're just kind of like everybody else, except for kind of not. And it's a really fun podcast to do. It's a lot of discussions about the creative side of it rather than the physical side of it. But it is kind of like the reason I kind of started the podcast is I started this business because I did feel like I was at this point with my performing work and that where I'd kind of hit this wall professionally. And I didn't feel like all of my talents were being used. I didn't quite know what the next step was. So I thought a lot about it and like quit for a while and went to India and like bummed around. And then I decided to write an ebook. And I sold it and it did really well. And so I created a business and I was like, well, what else would I want to do as far as like resources, information for and about the community? And the podcast was really big to me to do. And around that same time, I was getting really into understanding personal finance and kind of like how I, as a mostly contracted but mostly like freelance or contracted worker, could set my life up in a way that would enable me to continue to make art and do what I wanted to do. Mm-hmm. And I saw a real like gap, not only between like the rest of the world and my community, but my community and the understanding of finance.
It's so real. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I really started to put feelers out, and I interviewed Paula Pants. Do you know?
Oh, cool. Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So I interviewed her, and it was a good discussion, but I felt like I needed someone who was a little bit more on the creative side, or understood the artist. I want to say artist plight a little bit better. And so I kind of put out feelers and put it out on Instagram. And
that's really interesting. I mean, it's so, that makes a lot of sense. And for me, like getting interested into finance or like financial understanding was kind of similarly, like as an artist and creative, I was like, well, heck, how is this going to work? How am I going to build something functional with like the core understanding that I'm a creative person and I want to like center creativity in my life. And I think, part of it was like just having that curiosity, part of it was having at least like the basic understanding that like, even if I didn't know how money worked, I knew that it was going to be important to figure it out if I wanted to have a sustainable life experience. And I guess willingness, right? Like, well, here goes. I guess if, I mean, it's like the thinking that like, you have to put the oxygen mask on yourself, right? Like the realization that like, I'm like, well, the person most interested in my personal sustainability is me. And the person who's most responsible for it is me. So why don't I start doing some reading and learning? And that was many years ago when I like felt much more freaked out about money, when I first started this journey. And I felt like, oh my gosh, it's overwhelming. And it's, also not, I wasn't sure that like anything that I was trying was going to work, but I was like, all I can do is learn as much as I can, right? In order to test things and put the best things in place that I can for the level that I'm at, right? And some of that was just figuring out how to like do businessy type things as a freelancer, right? So it was like get paid as a freelancer, pay taxes as a freelancer. Oh, wait, there's this thing called writing off expenses. What's that? Okay, let's learn all about that. Oh, that means I can pay less taxes. Cool. I mean, taxes, I at a high level, like I don't want to hate on taxes because they, contribute to like our libraries and like public water.
Yeah, but, hopefully.
Yeah. I mean, ideally, right? Like,
yeah.
But like, and like our city and state taxes, depending on where you live, at least in the US, like much like heavily contribute to like our quality of life type spending. But any hooser, from a personal standpoint, right? Like paying taxes is, especially when you're a freelancer, is like a bite, Mm-hmm. Like, oh man, there goes what felt like my money and isn't anymore, but understanding that and understanding how to put some just like tracking in place so that, okay, well, if I'm, if my work that I'm getting paid for is freelance, and that's considered a business when I have to go do my taxes, well, then maybe I should be tracking this in a business kind of way. And I was using this idea of like taking myself seriously, so that even when I was not making tons of money in my creative work or freelance work, I would treat a $50 check the same way I would treat a $500 check, the same way I would treat a $5,000 check, right? Like they all got the same attention. And that let me put systems in place that let me kind of build and scale the work that I was doing. And as I was scaling it, everything was ready to go.
Can we get a little more specific on what kind of art you do, what you were making, what those first few years looked like?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've always done what I've been taught is called parallel tracking. So I've had multiple jobs, which I think is pretty familiar to creatives. So I will have for many years, I had some sort of part-time job, right? And, when I first started out, that was working at a vintage store and then doing my creative practice, which has looked like live performance. And so that's manifested as everything from performing texts, so like poetry, spoken word, or like reading, things that I've written, to more theatrical performances, so kind of theater, to multimedia performances that involve video and audio and recordings and costumes and multiple people, to like community engaged live performance where you get people to come and be part of your performance. So
very cool.
I started off as a writer and quickly I felt lonely. And I thought, I was like, man, how can I like do this work but be around people? And so figuring out how to take the writing that I was doing and do it in real time with other people quickly became very important to me as like a way to be a creative person, but also be in community and be socially connected to other people.
Nice. So it sounds like you had what did you call it? Parallel
tracking.
Parallel tracking. Okay. So you had like your, what I would think of as like a day job, or your like, sustainable income over time. And then you had your more creative endeavors. Totally.
And it allowed a couple things to happen, right? Like creative endeavors that I would get paid a little bit at, kind of, it's always allowed me to think like, well, if I truly hate this day job, I can quit. And like, there's a little bit of money coming in until the next thing happens, which has always felt really freeing for me as someone who, for many years in my life, didn't feel like I had access to day jobs that were super interesting to me. Like I've worked really great day jobs, for what they were, but for many years I felt like, meh, I wish I was doing art instead. Right. So yes, I would have that practice going on, and then I would have whatever my creative practices were. Right. And so, but still parallel tracking, right? Like doing art, like for about 7 years, I was a curator and performer of a LGBTQ touring arts event. And so we would have a monthly event in Brooklyn, New York, and we once a year would tour part of the US and or Canada. And I'll always remember, like, after I booked it with a longtime collaborator and friend. That project was called Heels on Wheels Roadshow. And we ran the numbers after the first tour was done. And we looked at like, the money that we made in our like little Kickstarter to get going, and the money that we made at shows, and the gas we put in the car, and the food we bought for artists, and the tragically small amount of money we paid our artists. And we realized that she and I took home the equivalent of 10 cents an hour for our work. Mm-hmm. Fuck, So
yeah.
and that's real, right? That's like the real life of artists. Like we were fed, we were housed, we were paid in, creativity and adventure and social connections and experiences that were more valuable than money can put a number to. But we had to stop and be like, okay, like if we were just looking at this economically, it's not sustainable. So what are we going to do, and how do we want to approach this project so that we can either change our definition of what sustainability looks like for this project, or set up our lives so that we're sustainable and this project can continue, even though it, as an ecosystem unto itself, is not economically sustainable.
And what was your solution?
Our solution, was that the project itself was not going to economically sustain us for the time we put into it. Yeah. And we decided as curators that it was important to us to be able to, I mean, if we had never paid any of our artists, it might have given us like a $15 an hour sort of wage, which is, fine. It is what we're fighting for everyone in the US. But that's not also not a truly sustainable amount of money. So we made the decision that we would
it wouldn't be sustainable to continue to make the art if you don't pay the artists.
That's true. That's
right?
Exactly it. Yeah. So we were like, that's not right. And that's not how we want to show up to this work. So for us, we were like, you know what, we are going to figure out a situation in which everyone gets an honorarium. And that project, it was a project that was led by poor and working class artists, including myself and my other co-collaborator. And so we were like, what we would much rather do is just be transparent about how the money works in this project so that everyone sees what's happening. And we all know that like we're all getting an honorarium and where that money's coming from and what that looks like and why it's happening the way it's happening.
That's such an interesting approach to it. I really like that you did that. And I've been on contracts before where I've known that I'm making more money than other people because of the way I've negotiated. Or why do you think more companies choose not to be transparent about what they pay their artists and other people who work there?
I think that's a great question. There are probably a couple things at play. There like very well may be privacy laws at play in which you can't reveal what people are paid. It might be different in terms of revealing an honorarium because that's not considered like under employment law, right? Like the privacy around it just might not be as restrictive. I think that there's also just like secrecy around what people get paid in general and like some recalcitrance to talk about our salaries. Right. And that's, has manifested, to the detriment of people, in particular women and folks of color when trying to like negotiate salaries. Right. Because if you don't know, then you don't know what to ask for. So I think there's also potentially some, depending on the company, there's some interest on the part of the like company to, not reveal that certain people make more because then the fear might be that everyone will want to earn more and that might not be sustainable for the company. Or it might be. We don't know. Right? Mm-hmm. I mean, sure. Finances are so often such a black box. Some sort of grants go in, some sort of checks come out. What happens in the middle is a mystery that a very few people have input to.
So when you were working as a freelancer, even in your, as an artist and as a graphic designer, which is also a type of artist, mm-hmm. But in all of those fields, how did you start to price your work then?
That's a great question.
Thank you.
Yeah. I started to price my work. I mean, when I first started, I just came up with a number that was, in my estimation now, way too low because I priced it not necessarily thinking about all the, how do I want to say this? When I first started pricing my work, I just priced it at like a little bit more than what I was making per hour at like the temp job I happened to have at the time. Right. Mm. I was like, oh, I make $25 an hour at this temp job. I'll charge $40 an hour for graphic design. Too low. Why is it too low? Because I wasn't at that time, and this is part of what the learning was for me. I wasn't taking into account the fact that when you work for yourself, at least in the US, you have to pay some extra taxes called self-employment tax. And I wasn't taking into account that like the hours that I would work as a freelancer would need to contribute to my health insurance or to putting money into my retirement. Like I just didn't do all the math. Right. And so when I talk to people now, I say, look, think about like the hourly wage that you want to get. Like the one that like if you were working for somebody else, you might get, and at least double it in terms of, just to account for all these other things that the money needs to do. You won't always necessarily get it, but like that would be an ideal goal. And I often help like in terms of talking with people about money and about setting prices. I think it's complex because it depends in part like how many hours you might do for the job, right? And it also depends a bit on this extremely vague notion called value, right? What is the value of the job?
Totally.
My God. And it's like, and I think value like it comes into this question where we start thinking about like, why aren't artists paid a living wage often? Why are artists paid a wage that like in other industries would be considered really low? Like what's going on here in the US or, just like in the art ecosystem in general, right? And I think part of it is this question of like, what's the value of art, right? To me and to creatives, I would say the value of art is really high, right? It's high culturally, it's high emotionally. If you're a physical artist, right, and you're the one practicing it, it's high. There's a high physical value, right? You're very fit. There's all sorts of values, but they might not manifest economically, right? Or we might not be in a like social cultural time that attaches a financial value to these other high values that exist, right? Which is a mistake in my opinion, right? Other countries, Canada, for example, isn't like, is much more fluid in its like grants that it gives to artists, right? Both like federally and in the provinces, because they, as a society, have decided they want to value the production of art a bit more highly. And this sort of manifests in other Western and Westernized countries across the world. Not that artists are paid like hugely in those places, but they're paid more than they are in the US, right. in general. Like there's this
I contemplated for a very long time moving to Berlin because of that, because of the ways and the support structures built in that support artists.
Exactly. Yeah. No.
What do you think, or have you had any musings about what historically or culturally in the U.S. has created this?
I think that there's a couple things going on. I think that in the U.S. there's this like deep mythology of individualism and like that like certain individuals will rise and they must be the most talented or the smartest or the best at getting something done. And I think in particular, when it comes to art, that's just patently untrue, right? The people who rise are people who are certainly smart and talented, right? But are one of many really brilliant people, for sure. Who happen to be in the right place at the right time with the right people who could, take them to that next level, which often looks like having some sort of sponsor or patron or et cetera, right? Or that one grant or that one show or that one buyer. Because in the US, there's so much mythology around like what success looks like and that it should be possible because a couple people have managed to do it, that therefore a lack of success, I think, also gets individualized. What do I mean by that? The systemic functions that are in play that might lift up one person and kind of not leave other people behind, but just not lift everybody up, are made to seem as if the people who aren't wildly successful are somehow individually responsible for their lack of success. And I think that we see this work across the board in how our economic system functions. So an example of this is that in my work with Ride Free Fearless Money, I do classes and workshops and coaching. And so I've worked with a couple hundred people really, really doing deep dives into their money and their attitudes and approaches to money and how they spend it and what they want to do with it. And something that stood out to me is that regardless of folks' class backgrounds or current experiences, so people who are poor and working class all the way up to people who are quite wealthy and have inherited money, there's a sense that they individually aren't doing something right. Like they individually, personally have messed up, or they individually aren't good at money, or like can't get this stuff. And so when I see a pattern like that happening across so many kinds of people, to me that's a flag that it's not individual at all. It's systemic, right? That there's something within how our economic system works that it serves the system, right, for individuals to think that they're, quote, not doing money right.
Well, I also think that there is a lack of education around money.
Oh, there's certainly a lack of education around money, and we could all know a ton more about how it works. But I also think that there's this like artificial divide with believing that like you have to have some sort of like really formal education to be good at money, right? There are plenty of people who are great at money who didn't have to get an MBA to do so.
What do you
right?
think it means to be good at money?
I mean, I think being good at money really just means that you understand what your money is doing and that you're intentionally using your money to serve your life and your values. And that will look different for people at different income levels and with different values and priorities.
And so you would argue that there is something systemic that keeps people from putting their money toward their values.
I think there's something systemic in that keeps people from realizing that they can put their money towards their values, or for feeling like empowered in the first place, right? To get in there and start figuring it out. It's interesting because here in the economic system we're in, I like to think about the money we can choose to spend and the money we can't choose to spend. What do I mean by that? So for most of us, there's like a baseline of spending that is like relatively required for us to have the basic necessities, a place to live, food to eat, and on top of that, for some people, right, there's sometimes like student loan payments to be made, right? There's some like baseline that the way I'd like to say it is like, if I don't pay for this, like things are going to go really wrong, right? And then on top of that, there's a layer of money that we have, which for most of us is smaller or bigger, depends, that we have a little bit more choice about. Do I want to pay for healthcare? Do I want to pay for like a nice plan or like a mini plan? Do I want to buy just whatever food is just whatever? Or do I want to like really intentionally choose organic or local? All of these are choices. Do I want to buy used clothes or new clothes? Okay. As soon as we get into the level of like spending that is at all discretionary, we start getting into the choices that we can make. And I think that's where it starts to get interesting for those of us who are living financially sort of, I don't even want to say non-traditional, because like a third of workers have freelance income. So it's not
I did not know that. That's so interesting.
By 2020, it's estimated that like 40% of people in the US will be getting income via freelance work.
And that's just any kind of income. That doesn't mean they're solely living off of that income. That could be people with
side hustles.
Got it. Okay.
Right. So it's actually a huge amount of individuals, right, who are figuring this stuff out and who are experiencing getting income in the way that freelance is, which is like a little bit at random, a lot here, a little there, none for a while, right? Who are like on this kind of weird bumpy pattern road.
I did want to go back to something that you talked about earlier, which is this idea, mostly in the US, but I do kind of see it in other countries as well, that artists don't make as much because there's not a perception that the value of art is as great as, say, medicine or other fields. Do you think that there's something that artists could do to prove their value?
I think at the current state that we're in, that the people best positioned to solve this are the funders of art. I say that because so many arts organizations are nonprofits, right, and receive their money through grants. And grants come from all kind of places, right, from like the federal government a little bit to a ton of like private foundations, family foundations, etc. And over the last 8 years or so, 5-6 years, if you have a foundation and that foundation is invested in the stock market, you've made a lot of money. Your foundation is stacked, right? So as someone who is in charge of money in a foundation, you have fiscal responsibility. Depending on the way the foundation is set up, you might have to actually distribute a certain percent each year. You might have complete choice over how much you distribute. That said, like so many funders, in my estimation, don't understand that, because they're, if you're working for a foundation, you probably have a salaried job. You might have no idea what it's like, to be going from $1,500 check to $1,500 check. But frankly, if funders, across the board made the decision that they're like, look, we are going to fund, but we are going to increase the line that directly goes to paying creative work, that money would trickle forward. I mean, they're the ones with the money, right? Like if we want to think systemically about how artists and creatives can get paid, we have to ask the question on who has the money and how can that money get to artists, right? So, I like to think in as big ways as possible. So I'm thinking about the funders, right? The other way that we can do it is like, as individuals, when we are going to see the shows of artists, right? When we're going to like engage with creative production, paying for art, right? Like paying, if it's a sliding scale to get into an event, paying as high on the scale as you can, right? Like literally contributing directly to artists more, like paying for people's, paying to participate in people's Patreons, right? Or fundraising campaigns. Like these make a really big difference.
This podcast is actually entirely funded by Patreon.
Yeah. Excellent. These are great ways. Like, it's like, I would say like all the way at the top, right? Like funders, just like redistribute those resources. You have so much, and then all the way down at the bottom, right? Like these little additional $5, $10, $20 that we could leak towards each other will also make a difference. And then that's sort of like, that's the way that people are thinking about it in terms of like some of the new methodologies and technologies that are being built that might allow the creation of platforms in which people sort of ante up at the beginning of joining the platform and then like take that ante they've put in and distribute a bit to each artist they interact with on the platform, right? So that's sort of like a, moving the money at the bottom scenario. And one other thing that I think might be important to think about is the idea of like who has the economic ability to make art, and not be paid well for that art. There's no shade, right, in being a person who has resources coming in from other places, right? Whether that be another job, whether that be a partner with money, whether that be a trust fund, whatever it is, right? But when that's not an open topic on the table, it looks as if it's fine for artists to be paid at a lower wage because for some people it appears to be sustainable and not a problem.
Interesting.
And they're getting their teeth fixed and they live in a nice house, I think it doesn't reveal the full economics of like maybe some individuals' ecosystems that makes it look like some of the low wages that artists get are sustainable. Whereas if you didn't have, some sort of support, it wouldn't be sustainable.
That's a great point. Thank you for addressing that. I wanted to talk a little bit, because you do talk so much and guide people on personal finance, to get to some practical advice for individual artists. And I'm interested, what are the commonalities you see or the common questions you get with people who reach out to you for the first time?
One of the common things that people bring to me when we talk for the first time is a desire to feel a sense of control, right? A sense of like control around their money. And it seems to stem from a couple different things. Sometimes for people, it's feeling like they're getting money, but then it's going out as soon as they get it. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it just feels like, the whole system is imbalanced, right? Like the ship's leaking water. I don't know why, or, or maybe it's like, the ship's in a storm. What do I do? One way that I like to talk about, what to do next when you might feel like wanting a better sense of control or wanting to be in control with your money is that to me, the first practical step to do is to pause and say, well, okay, like what's my money doing right now? Right? To actually do like a snapshot, if you will. And a snapshot can look like a couple things. It can look like, do I have money in any accounts? If so, what are those accounts? How much money is in them? I have a savings account with some money in it. I have a little retirement account from an old job. I have my checking account, whatever it might be. So that's like one version of the snapshot. The next sort of layer of the snapshot is like, what have I spent money on recently? Right? And that can look like looking back over the last week to the last month and just literally like looking at what you spent and maybe categorizing it, right? Here's the money I spent on food. Here's what I spent on traveling. Here's what I spent on rent, etc. And just like stopping to get a snapshot like that can be extremely informative because it lets us operate from a place of informed reality as opposed to like speculative worry. And we don't always like what reality has to tell us. You don't have to take that snapshot and feel like sunshines and roses. But informed reality will allow us to make informed decisions. And that's very powerful, right? And that's like a getting towards a place of control, because an informed decision can look like, oh crap, I spend so much more money than I thought I did on car services, and I feel like I want to change that. Or maybe an informed reality snapshot learning might look like, okay, well, I'm actually living within my means, but my means are really small. How could I change that? Or an informed reality snapshot might lead someone to say, oh, actually, everything looks like I expected it would. Okay, I'm not out of control, right?
Yeah, I have that experience actually a lot, where I'll not look at my bank account for a while and kind of freak out, and then check in on everything and be like, oh, no, it's okay.
Yeah, and I think
even that action of checking is so...
That action of checking, that's exactly it, right? It's like, I work with people all the time who have maybe just gotten so like nervous about or alienated from checking on their finances that the act of taking that first step to check feels daunting. Mm-hmm. But just doing it, like just looking at it, it's always less stressful to have the real numbers to make decisions from and learn from than it is to worry about what the numbers might be.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about this really cool phrase that you have on your website, hacking capitalism.
Yes.
Can you talk about hacking capitalism a bit?
Yes, I certainly can. So hacking capitalism as a phrase came out of my training as a technologist in a way, right? And from the perspective of a technologist, a hack is just a workaround. It's a way to get something done, to get information, to build something, et cetera, and so on. So hacks aren't necessarily all negative. Hacks are actually very creative applications of in any interaction that you might have with the environment around you. You know, at a simplest form, a hack could be, I'm walking down the street, I see that the sidewalk in front of me is blocked off, I walk around it, right? I've hacked the broken sidewalk by getting onto the road. You know,
Gotcha.
It's like, and so a hack for capitalism is taking the information that you have about how the economic system that we're in, capitalism, works, and then identifying any blocks that might be in front of you and figuring out what you need to do to get around them so you can keep going, right? Whether that's in service of your art, yourself, your community, whatever it may be. For freelancers, that can look like, okay, well, I don't have a stable job and everything's happening all willy-nilly. The money comes in and then it doesn't. A hack could look like taking a snapshot of the money you've made over the last year and saying, okay, well, on average, I bring in $2,000 a month. So I'm going to test out living on $2,000 a month, even on months where I bring lots more. So that hack is like being your own stopper on it, right? You're essentially, quote, building your own salary at that time. Or a hack might be like stopping to understand how in the US, like write-offs work on your taxes, so that if you're being paid as a freelancer, or, you know, any payment you get that isn't already taxed, means that you are able to write off things like your cell phone and part of your internet bill, and maybe things that you had to buy that, you know, costumes if you're a performer, or travel to go to networking events, right? Things you might have done anyway because you're engaged in the community that you're engaged in can actually also reduce your tax burden, right? So a hack is like stopping.
I think a lot of people artists don't quite realize that, how much actually you can write off for those things. Tons. So like, you know, for the IRS in the US, it's like any sort of business instance, right? A project, if you will, it only has to be profitable in 3 out of any 5 years, right? So think about if you weren't an artist and you were starting some like any random kind of business, right? A taco truck, whatever. There's always the assumption, I love tacos. There's the assumption that like, you know, like the first year or two you started up a business, it's not profitable because you're getting it together. You had to invest in a whole bunch of things. You had to find people, you're figuring it out. And it's also assumed that like, you know, over the course of running a business, some years are going to be expensive. Maybe you had to buy a lot of stuff, or maybe it was a slow year in business, so you won't be profitable. Most years you
should show a profit, but that profit doesn't have to be huge, right? And let me give some specific numbers. Like, say that you made $8,000 in a given year. You can have $7,500 of expenses. And also reasonably, you totally could have $7,500 of expenses, especially if you traveled a lot for work and had to have costumes, things like that. You know, if you're traveling for work, you can write off up to $50 a day for food. If you're working in the town that you live, whether on a day that you're working or if you're taking out a client in the place where you live, you can write off 50% of that, half of it. You can write off taxis. You can write off, as long as you're like going to a gig, you know, Metro cards, all these things. You know, performers, we have special things we can write off. My accountant, who I love, he's like, well, what about, the pantyhose and stuff you've bought? And I'm like, pantyhose? Like, what year is it, man? But he's like, look, like this is, like when you're filling out these forms, and let me pull back for a second, for people who have who earn income as freelancers, I think it's really, really valuable at least once to work with an accountant, because they will break things down for you. They will explain it to you. They will tell you what to do, and you'll learn so much, and they'll also just save you so much money, right? So you can do this stuff on your own, but if you feel overwhelmed, just track all your expenses that you spent on your projects for a year. Keep as many receipts as you possibly can, and trot over to meet with an accountant when it's time to do your taxes, because they will explain all of this.
That's great advice. Yeah.
So worth it. So worth it.
I love my accountant as well. She's everything.
Yeah. I mean, these people are like, they're geniuses, and they truly do work in service of creatives and freelancers, because those are the folks who are coming in going, please help me.
The thing that I'm still curious about, though, is all of these recommendations seem to work inside of the system of capitalism. So if you're working inside the system, how are you getting out of it, right? How are you getting to a place where your money is recirculated into social supports for people who may not be able to, because they didn't come from a trust fund, or they didn't, win a lawsuit when they were 12 against a sidewalk company or something.
Mm-hmm. Right.
How are there other structures or other ways to recirculate or hack capitalism that benefit other artists?
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing that back up. I mean, so a hack for capitalism can be, to me, it's anything that you do where you understand how the system of money works, right? So, in order to leverage some goal. And so for artists, right, and like artist ecosystems in particular, that can look like one of the things we talked about earlier, right? It could look like, if you go to an artist run space or artist run event, making sure that you pay at the door, or like contribute directly to artists. Money that we contribute directly to artists is direct support. It could also look like, working with an artist group or collective to help them do fundraising, or to help them set up a Patreon page, or to help them apply for a grant or something like that, right? Like that's in the mix.
So it's a donation of time and skills, not just money.
Absolutely. Right. Absolutely. I mean, I think it's interesting, right? Like to me, it's important that we be both practical, right? Here we are in capitalism. I want everyone to like eat healthy food and get their teeth fixed, and like have the things that we need. So it's important to be practical, but it's also important to be visionary, right? Like, how might we act so that we can be aware of the fact that money is just, it's both a sort of tactical thing, but it's also a proxy, like money just is like a little proxy for value, right? And like, we're so saturated in like money equals dollars equals worth, right? Money's also this other thing. Like humans have, way before the existence of a little paper dollar, way before the existence of capitalism, humans have exchanged with each other. Like there's an amazing book called Debt, the First 5,000 Years by this researcher, David Graeber, who talks about sort of like the history of debt as like social interconnectedness. So like if I grew a bunch of amaranth and you grew a bunch of persimmons, right? Maybe my crop comes up first. So I give you some of this crop and you're like, oh, thank you so much. Now I have this healthy whole grain. But you also are like, oh, you feel like you should give something back to me, like this sense of informal osies, as it were. And it can be hard for us to wrap our minds around because, here in our current economic system, we think of debt as something terrible, and it is, it manifests very, brutally right now, but it doesn't have to manifest brutally is the idea. Being indebted to somebody could just manifest as like being excited that soon I'll get to give you something, and next time you'll give something to somebody else. There's other economies of exchange that are possible, right? There's other economic systems that are completely possible. And I think especially artists and creatives, we participate in these systems all the time, even if we're not necessarily using money. If,
totally.
Like if as an artist, you use another artist's studio in exchange, promote their show or whatever it might be, help them print their flyers. Again, this is exchange of resources. It just might not be financial resources in particular at that moment. And that's a hack, right? Like that's absolutely a workaround.
That's so interesting. I love that definition of debt. It puts a really positive spin on it.
Yeah, which like usually we don't get when we're talking about debt.
Sure.
Well,
because usually we're thinking of it in terms of finance, and who we owe is not necessarily a fellow artist. It's a bank or it's a...
Totally. And I feel like a final hack for capitalism is just like buy less stuff. Like we're in like corporate consumer capitalism right now. Like if we were to buy less stuff, and by the way, there's like for the most part enough stuff.
This is something actually I had no idea how to frame this question, but I have this really interesting situation right now where I'm on Instagram a lot, and I'm developing a really great following, and I get reached out to all the time by companies who sell leggings or t-shirts,
right.
these kinds of things. And they're like, if you wear this and you do something cool in the fabric, we'll send you X amount of dollars. And even though I would love that X amount of dollars, it just is so ethically against everything that I've always believed as someone who's owned the same pair of leggings for the past 6 years to support that. But it's hard because as a creative or as an artist, like that is a way to leverage my skill set to produce income. Totally.
And you get to decide, right? Like you get to decide to be like, well, is my hack saying yes to sponsorships, right? And being like, hashtag sponsored, these leggings are comfortable, which if they are, go ahead and say it. And that's a hack for you because that's like, however many, X number of like hours that you get back into your life to put either into your practice or some other endeavor that you want to pursue.
But again, you have to ask, like, what does that do for other artists, or what does that do for the greater community when they see that? Are they going to go out and buy a $50 pair of leggings, or can they spare, $50 to a Kickstarter campaign?
Totally. And I think, it comes down to like, hopefully people realizing that like they have individual choice. For the person who has $50 for leggings, I might guess that they might have $50 for leggings and a Kickstarter campaign. And I think it comes down to like this intentionality of what we're spending our money on, right? And so there is this like individual level of like, are we spending money in line with the values that we want to see in the world? To me, right, like I would much rather personally, I'm like, I would totally do a sponsored campaign, because I know it for myself. It would like allow me to, like, I do sliding scale for my courses. It might let me do like a free course again. That would be awesome. I think that we can any of us could make decisions about how we want to be intentional with the money that comes in. And for any of us who are like being advertised to, no matter how that advertisement is happening, we get to decide if we want to engage with that ad or not. In general, there's enough stuff, but at the same time, like that doesn't mean that each of us who, if we have resources, has to live in scraps and rags either. It's okay, I think, to buy things when the time is right to buy something. I mean, to me, like one of the whole arguments for economic justice, for universal basic income, for getting artists paid is so we're able to have that be a choice, right? So it's not just, well, I'll never buy new leggings because I have no resources to do so. It's, oh, I have the resources. It's time for new leggings. Now I can get them. So like that's the situation I want us all to be in, a situation of choice, right? And the fact that people aren't in that situation of choice is wherein lies the problem.
That's so interesting. And a great place to kind of end. Though I feel like I could talk to you for another 6 hours about this.
Same.
Awesome. I do have one final question for you, which I ask all of my guests.
Okay.
Which is, what advice would you give to yourself at the beginning of your career? And as a freelancer, how you define career is entirely up to you.
I mean, I think at the beginning of my like creative production career, I would definitely advise myself to worry less and like just keep making work and interacting with other artists. And I would advise myself, that the future is going to be long and there's going to be plenty of things to worry about. So
don't worry, there's plenty of things to worry about.
Don't worry, it'll come down the pipeline. But to, as a younger artist, I was like really great at creating work and documenting work and putting it out in the world. But I also just was worried about like how it was going to be sustainable and how it was going to happen. And I would love to like look back and tell myself like, look, as a creative, you will figure it out. There are ways to figure it out. And the opportunities for creativity are going to go your whole life, right? They're going to look different over the course of your whole life, but they're going to keep going. So just let yourself do the work that you want to do with people that you want to be with and keep moving forward.
Rock. I love it. Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, Shannon, it was
awesome.
It was a pleasure. Also, you have a wonderful radio voice.
Oh, thank you.
How you doing, friends, fans, and enemies? I know, that was a long one. Thanks for sticking with me. I hope this episode, in some way, inspired you to start thinking, if you're not already. If you are, good for you. But if you're not, to start thinking about your own financial position. I think in the States especially, though I've heard this in other countries, we like to complain about how there's no money for the arts, how there's no way to fund the projects we want to make, the training we want to do. But as Hadassah says, you have to put the oxygen mask on yourself or take care of your own finances before you can start worrying about how to create art. That's just the world we live in and the reality of it. So, here are a few suggestions that Hadassah thinks will help you get started. Number 1, and I think this is the biggest one, especially if you're a person who is working another job or parallel tracking, as Hadassah calls it. It's to take the money you make from your art or your performing or your teaching, whatever you're doing, as seriously as the money you make from your other employment. And that means tracking it, setting some of it aside for taxes and retirement, even if it's just a $60 check for teaching a private lesson. Those habits are what will build financial success in the long run. Number 2 is to learn how to price your work. If you don't know how, start asking. Ask others in your market what they make and price yourself accordingly. It doesn't serve anyone, not you, not your client, not the community, not the industry, to work for less than the market value of the work you're selling. And if you're someone who's working in the industry, be open about what you're getting paid, as much as your contracts will allow, of course. Companies don't like to be transparent about how much they're paying their artists, but you can work to help everyone get a fair wage. Number 3, get an accountant. Even if you only see them once ever and all you have is one bank statement from like Bank of America with like an overdraft fee on it or some shit, I don't care. As Hadassah says, informed reality will help us make informed decisions. So, you can choose to stress out about what you don't know, or invest in learning from someone who knows more than you about financing an artist's lifestyle. Just like if you didn't know how to do a trick, you would get a coach. Right? Hadassah is not an accountant, but she does have an amazing blog and services on a sliding scale that can help you in your journey to financial understanding, which is actually the journey that frees you to make more art, which makes the world a better place for all of us. So, thanks for paying attention. You can visit her website at www.ridefreefearlessmoney.com. Again, that's www.ridefreefearlessmoney.com. If you're an aerialist and want training tips and inspiration, and not a lot to do with finance at all, you can visit me at theartistathlete.com. I'm on Instagram at _artist_athlete, and I'm on Facebook, The Artist Athlete, which I hardly ever use, but there you go. If you like the podcast, subscribe, rate, and review, and tell all your friends who are artists and athletes. Talk at you next week, friends, fans, and enemies. The Artist Athlete podcast is supported solely by donations from people like you. Here's what some of those people have to say.
Hi, I'm Katie Betts, and I'm the director of Shared Culture Concepts, which is a full-service marketing company for circus and performing arts. You can visit our website at www.sharedcultureconcepts.com. On the website, you can find a copy of our ebook, which covers basics of marketing, specifically for circus educators, coaches, studio owners, and circus artists.
Aloha! My name is Beth Russell, and I live on the beautiful island of Maui, Hawaii. I am an aerial artist and movement instructor specializing in chakra yoga to keep me balanced and grounded. I play with silks, trapeze, lyra, rope, acro, aerial yoga and dance, slacklining, pole, bungee, and climbing. Really anything that goes up and allows me to explore 3D space. You can find my dedicated aerial page on Instagram at Maui Aerialist. If you find yourself coming to Maui, let's play.
Hey there, friends, fans, and enemies. This is Chris Alston, Patreon of the Artist Athlete podcast. Straps artist and lyra performer and acrobat out of Greenville, South Carolina. So, if you're ever passing through, make sure to stop in and see me and my friends. We have a wonderful space, and we'd love to see you.
Hi, my name is Erica Lee. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, and I'm an aerialist. I teach performing arts to elementary school during the day and do pole and swings and ropes by night. I really, really like the Artist Athlete podcast because it gives me a lot of circus goals to look forward to. It gives me a lot of insight on what's going on around the world in circus, and that's why I'm a Patreon.
Hello, all. Thank you for tuning in to the Artist Athlete podcast. I am Opal Schwartz from Minneapolis, Minnesota. If you're ever in the cities, feel free to stop by the Aviary Minneapolis. It's a great time. With that, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week, and goodbye.